In this lecture, we're looking at the Black Church and the Civil Rights Movement. And what we're looking at now is the ongoing evolution of what is happening as America is moving out of the context of the Civil War, and they're beginning to increasingly come to the realization that they have to deal with the ongoing effects of segregation, the Jim Crow laws, and a number of things that carried on after the end of the Civil War in a way that had not been anticipated with the ending of slavery officially. And this part of the story brings together a number of different threads that we've already looked at. Namely, we've looked at the issues of the abolitionist movement, which was very, very popular among some evangelical groups, as well as the ongoing rise of Pentecostalism and the intermingling, as we saw in our last lecture, within the ongoing unfolding of the revival movements that were part and parcel to the evangelical world. So what we're going to look at now is how the story unfolds throughout the majority of the 20th century. Because what begins to happen is, as we've seen, as fundamentalists in some evangelical groups begin to become very much opposed to the changes in society, to the ongoing fights of modernity, as well as to the lingering questions related to the Bible's position on the equality of all people. It is the Black Church itself that comes into its own and begins to find its voice, and really begins to protest and to raise all types of issues, which we'll say in this lecture are not so much the first time these things have ever been voiced, but rather it's the Black Church that is reminding evangelicalism and reminding Protestants that the abolitionist movement was part and parcel to their vision, and that the story needs to continue, and that the full equality of all people needs to be realized. And we want to begin by talking about the religious perspective of first the slaves prior to the Civil War, and then the unfolding of that story thereafter. Of course, those who were brought over to the New World as slaves were not themselves Christian. They came from a wide variety of different backgrounds, different tribes, different languages, and a lot of diversity that was present in Africa when the slave trade began. And this really should be appreciated. The variety of the experience of those who came over in the African slave trade was pretty diverse. In fact, one of the things that slave owners would do in order to quell the idea of rebellion, or to stymie or to suppress any idea of resistance to slavery, is it was pretty common to purchase slaves from different backgrounds, and in particular to purchase slaves who spoke two different languages. The idea here is that when you bring over groups of the same background from the same tribe who speak the same language, what you do is you bring the cultural legacy with them. And so one of the more devastating realities of slavery is that because there was a systemic idea that slaves from the same region or from the same area were not to be mingled together whenever possible, and whenever possible, some of the cultural heritage, some of the language, this type of thing, was to be resisted or suppressed. What happens is African culture coming over with the slaves was very quickly muddled at first and then homogenized into a broader experience of the slaves here in America. Of course, they very quickly learned English. They had to. First generations, of course, would be very poor with it, but as they had children, those children would be raised speaking English, and whenever possible, slave owners would make sure that their cultural legacy was lost. So one of the issues that this brings up, though, is that any native religious expression that would have been there in Africa either develops in different ways in the context of America, or at times it is lost. So in a way, there were not pockets of resistance as to whether or not religion from the old world of Africa would be carried on with any serious effort. And there are always exceptions to this, of course, but by and large, the process was designed to end any of this cultural legacy. The other curious feature was that slaves very often were not allowed to learn how to write or to read. And you see kind of an inverse reality. Often we've said in the past, whenever missionaries go out into the far-flung areas of the world, one of the tactics very often is to train people in how to read and write, or to train them in the English language. And very often the text they'll use is the Bible. The belief is that if you train them in how to read, you'll also be exposing them to the scriptures. In this case, those slaves were often forced not to learn how to read for fear that this would somehow make them unwieldy, make them rebellious, make them more free-thinking on their own. At least this was the idea, the philosophy that was in play. So when we get into the early 1800s, we have really a counterbalancing focus On the one hand, we have African religion that is becoming tamped down. It's being lost on some level, at least in terms of any type of organization. But on the other hand, there is nothing really that is being replaced with it. There are very few opportunities, in other words, prior to the early 1800s, for Africans who are either slaves or freed slaves to really have any access to the scriptures. They are, of course, uneducated. And if you just cast your eye across the colonial period, you see that very much the educated clergy ran the day. You had learned sermons from men like Jonathan Edwards, etc. The faith, in other words, was being spoken in a vocabulary that was principally for the educated, the wealthy, or at least those who were part of the white establishment here in the colonial period. All of this, though, begins to change with the context of the Second Great Awakening. Because as we've seen, the Second Great Awakening focuses enormously on those who are poor, illiterate, and those who simply do not have the resources themselves to really participate in some of the more intellectualist ideas of the colonial period. So in other words, just as the Second Great Awakening reaches out to poor whites in the post-colonial period, what this does is this begins to open doors to Africans, to slaves and freedmen, coming over to the faith with some earnest. And we've looked at one or two pieces of this already. Men like Black Harry Hosier riding around with Francis Asbury and preaching to groups that were predominantly white on not a few occasions. So it's in the context of the Second Great Awakening that we see a wider adoption of the Christian faith amongst those who were slaves or former slaves. And there's a lot of theological reasons for this, of course. The Second Great Awakening focused on the inner life, it focused on holiness, and it focused in a straightforward way on the immediacy of Christ in the life of anyone. You do not have to have a confessional, a creedal, or a denominational grid to approach conversion. And so we do see a number of Africans coming over to the faith. Now, one of the issues that is very much debated still today by scholars is to what extent did the old African way of doing their religious expression, things like music and dance, some of the roots that eventually become synonymous with the Black church today. Scholars are not sure to what extent these things are holdovers or adaptations from the African religious experience, or to what extent are these born out of the slave reality of the Americas. And frankly, there's no way to really solve this debate, and we're not going to go into it, but you should just know that there are all types of conversations as to what extent did the African experience come over and therefore shape the future of American expression through the Black church, or to what extent was it something that was native here to America as a result of the slave experience. But the important thing here is that in the context of the Second Great Awakening, we see finally a coming together of those who are African and those who are white here in the early days of the American nation. And we have noted before that the abolitionist movement was driven significantly, if not overwhelmingly so. Certainly not the only voice, but overwhelmingly so. The abolitionist movement was driven by evangelicalism. There was a real desire for what we call today social justice. The belief was if our gospel brings everyone to Christ, and if there is an egalitarian spirit brought about by the work of Christ, well then, what in the world are we doing suppressing an entire people simply for our labor and for the work on our plantations? The other feature that was realized in the context of the late 1700s was that so much of the rhetoric of the American Revolution churned on the reality that America was decrying the fact that they were being, quote, oppressed and suppressed and driven into slavery as a result of the British Empire. Well, a number of evangelicals, as well as others, note the irony in that comment. Note the fact that they themselves are enslaving so many other people while they complain about the tax on tea. And so for a number of years and decades, in particular, the Methodist and the Baptist churches become really wrapped up with the abolitionist movement. In fact, in both of those church denominations in the 1800s, the overwhelming consensus at times, depending on the area we're talking about, was that slavery was abhorrent and that it needs to be done away with. And so that partnership between those in the Great Awakening era, particularly the second one, as all these African slaves and freedmen are coming over into the faith, there is this real galvanizing reality that the two most influenced groups, the two most influenced denominations from the influx of Black Christians is the Baptist Church and the Methodist Church. In fact, to this day, if you include now Pentecostalism, Pentecostal Christians, Methodists of a variety of different stripes, as we'll see in a minute, and Black Baptists make up three of the groups that are the most heavily represented by African American Christianity today. It just simply becomes almost synonymous that Black Baptists, Black Methodists, and Black Pentecostals, given the tone of these three groups in particular, really becomes influential and influenced by all of these converts to the faith. Now, to add some nuance to that picture, we need to make very clear that what we're saying here is not that all Methodists and all Baptists, full stop, are in favor of abolition or a mixed church of racial harmony and bliss. Often what would happen is you would have Black Baptist churches not so much integrating with white churches, but rather forming their own conglomerations of their own denominations or their own churches. Well, the same thing happens with the Methodist Church. In the early 1800s, there were a number of Black converts to the faith. However, in certain pockets of New York and Philadelphia in particular, there was still felt oppression within these churches by some of the converts of the faith who were now free. Now, this raises one point that we're going to go ahead and stress right now. Racism is not a Deep South problem. Racism is an America problem. It is everywhere. As we'll see when we get to the Civil Rights Movement, there are just as many riots and problems in the North as there are in the Deep South. This is too often the assumption that there is no racism up north and that all racism comes from the Deep South. That's only natural, of course, because of the nature of the Civil War. However, racism is everywhere. What's different about the South is racism very often became violent. It is the South where you have things like lynchings, you have the rise of the KKK, etc. So the South is more violent about its racism, but racism is everywhere in the context of America. What happens to Black Methodists is in Philadelphia first, they began to become disenfranchised with the fact that though the Methodists held out the olive branch, that there was an equality between blacks and whites. The relationship in reality was far from harmonious. And so in 1814, Methodists began to realize that there is too much oppression in the city of Philadelphia. And so a very influential and important man, Richard Allen, leads out a number of Black Methodists from the existing Methodist Wesleyan Church, and he forms one of the most important Black denominations for the history of America and one of the most influential movements when he founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or the AME Church as it's often called today. And Richard Allen becomes the first bishop, and a lot of what you see is a carryover of just about the majority, if not almost the entirety, of the Methodist structure of church life and government. But rather you have the formation of a Black denomination in opposition to the ongoing perceived inequalities within the Methodist Church. And so the AME Church becomes, again, significantly influential over the years. In 1821, up in New York, in a similar move, there is formed the AME Zion Church, which is a different group in general, but with many of the same purposes. There is felt that there is oppression, that even freed blacks are being treated as less than brothers and sisters. And so the AME Zion Church is formed, and again, it continues on until this day. The AME and the AME Zion churches are, again, two of the most important and influential denominations in the context of the 19th and 20th century and even the 21st century now. But the reason, of course, that it has Methodist Episcopal in its name comes from the Second Great Awakening, comes from the original conversion of blacks, both slaves and freedmen, into the faith, and eventually the shakeout of the ongoing racism that was part of the American scene. And again, this is significantly important because the AME Church and the AME Zion Church over the decades and over the last 2 centuries is often the target of overt racism, hostility, and violence whenever there is a perceived problem amongst whites in certain communities. So, for example, in 1822, there was actually a slave revolt in the city of Charleston. And we can't go into all the details, but the revolt was pretty aggressive and a number of people died as a result. Well, obviously there were tortures and hangings and trials and all types of different things as the slave revolt was put down. But more importantly, in 1822, there in the city of Charleston, there stood an AME church, which was a symbol of the new independence of the black church that had come from the work of Richard Allen. And angered by the slave revolt, whites stormed the church and burned it to the ground. Now, it's important to note here we are in 2015, and of course, we've just had a mass shooting there in the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston. What not a lot of people have noticed is that this same church that was burned down in 1822 was rebuilt, and it underwent expansion and development, and here's a church that is now 200 years old. Well, this is the same church. The same church that was burned down in 1822 is the same one where we had the mass killing, the mass shooting here this year in 2015. The target, in other words, of AME churches is usually very pronounced over the decades and over the last 2 centuries, ever since the early 1800s. And the reason for this, again, is because they go independent. They stand on their own 2 feet, they develop their own denominational traditions. You might say that the formation of these black denominations is itself the same wellspring and the same emotional energy that we'll see in the civil rights movement a century later. Here you have churchmen, pastors, bishops, leading black congregations away from oppression and persecution and racism. And often, as a result, the desire of the black church to be on its own 2 feet is met with violence. So the story, in other words, up until the Civil War, is that you have a pretty large number of blacks that are converting to the Christian faith. They then take the fruits of the gospel, this call for freedom, this equality that we have in Christ. And when it is not lived out in white churches or in white denominations, they go their own way. And there are similar stories about black Baptists. And of course, we've already looked at the black Pentecostal movement with its desire for a mixed community that was often met with violence or resistance, or at least mockery. So that's really the context pre-Civil War. However, after the Civil War, we don't simply jump from the Emancipation Proclamation all the way to the Civil Rights Movement. Rather, the unfolding of the black church experience continues. In other words, the black church experience begins in the early 1800s, not after the Civil War. Prior to the Civil War, 90 to 92% of all African Americans that lived in America were slaves, meaning only 8 to 10%, of course, are freed. However, once there is a freedom granted to all slaves, the ongoing fight, of course, as we know, to segregate, oppress, and to carry on with not slavery, but with segregation, becomes the defining hallmark of the Reconstruction South and the first half of the 1900s. And the context of this, the laws that were put on the books, are 2 that we want to mention right now. In 1896, there was Plessy versus Ferguson, which is the ruling by the Supreme Court that the doctrine of separate but equal is perfectly fine, that there is no problem with it, and that therefore the unfolding of segregation itself after the Civil War may continue. So that is the real legal precedent in 1896, and it is not done away with until the Civil Rights Act in the early 1960s. More pervasive, though, were the so-called Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws come right after the Civil War, and they are more state and local laws designed, again, to enforce segregation in a very aggressive way. And the Jim Crow laws are pretty diverse. It depends on the community that we're talking about. Obviously, places like Birmingham, Alabama, which will become one of the epicenters of the civil rights movement, will have a different experience than a place in Florida, than a place in the Carolinas, etc. The Jim Crow laws is a catch-all, in other words, for all of these laws that were designed to segregate and to separate the newly freed blacks in America. And of course, we see all types of pictures of this, of the realities of segregation after the Civil War. You see it in things like even the movie Dumbo from Disney. I remember watching this movie with my children. I hadn't seen it since I was 5 or 6 years old. It had been quite some time. And I was completely shocked how, towards the end of the movie, which was made in 1941, you have a band of crows, the leader of whom is Jim Crow. Clearly stereotypical, cartoonish versions of black men who sing a little song and all this type of thing. And I dug a little deeper, and I actually found that there was more of this in the same movie. In the scene where men are hammering nails to put up the tent, the laborers are clearly black, and they sing a song. At the very end, the black laborers refer to themselves as apes. And just take that more as a way to remember what the Jim Crow laws are. There's all kinds of realities in the context of post-Civil War and pre-Civil Rights America that is just simply horrific. The other reality, though, from the Civil War that carries on is you have denominations that do have a number of black converts themselves splitting north and south as a result of different stances on the Civil War itself. So Baptists in 1845 split north and south. It's why to this day we have Northern Baptist and Southern Baptist. Methodists split in 1844 for the same reasons. Now they eventually come back together, and the Presbyterian Church as well, though with a fewer number of blacks in their midst, but still split over the issue of the Civil War, split North and South, and they didn't come back together again until a much later date. But what we have to remember at this point is that the Civil War and the ensuing Jim Crow laws and Plessy versus Ferguson and all the ensuing unfolding drama of black Christians and black citizens here in the States is not a monolithic or a simple story that we can tell in just simply a few minutes. But when we're looking at it from the vantage of the church, particularly from the white church, evangelicals, the problem here is that they are so divided in a way that they had never been before. Again, prior to the Civil War, evangelicals led the charge for abolition. However, as Mark Knoll has shown, the Civil War was a theological crisis within the church as much as it was a political crisis for the nation itself. And Mark Knoll is just simply brilliant in this book. He shows the variety of differences of opinion on the subject of slavery and the Bible. But above all, this is very interesting. He notes the number of those evangelicals and Protestants who live outside of America and their overwhelming, nearly 100% condemnation of the American addiction to slavery. And Mark Knoll comments that really what happens in the American evangelical church is a real deafening, a closing of the ears to brothers and sisters in Europe and in Canada who were saying, put an end to this, stop this. But here's the thing. Not all Christians, again, were in favor of slavery. In fact, we have to recognize how many evangelicals, at least to a greater or lesser extent, were in favor of abolition. It seemed to fit the ethos of the Second Great Awakening and the Wesleyan revivalistic movement, etc. The problem, though, is in different pockets and in different times, white churches will not listen to their own heritage on the subject, or they will forget it, or they will reject it. And again, in the run-up to the Civil War, people like William Lloyd Garrison, a very influential evangelical, said that until slavery is done away with, America has made a, quote, pact with the devil. Frederick Douglass himself, very, very influentially, pitted the biblical account of what a Christian looks like over against those Christians who served as his masters and whom he had seen in the context of slave ownership. And he says there is a fundamental divide in what we're seeing here. Those who are claiming the name of Christ, who are slave owners, often do not live up to their own values, their own claims to be Christian. And in 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin becomes an international and in particular a national sensation, as it is in narrative form, in a story form, a very overt evangelical call to the implications of their faith to put an end to slavery and to get behind abolition. And Uncle Tom's Cabin, of course, is a classic, but its context, its purpose, is to drive Christians to realize that if their faith is true, then what they are doing is wrong. Still, though, in the context of the reconstruction of the Deep South after the Civil War, and in the context of the early 1900s, as the Jim Crow laws became more and more ingrained, the stage was set for the civil rights movement. Early in the 1900s, in fact, you really see, again, the unfolding of the energy of black Christianity to stand up against the inequality within their communities. But here's the thing. Do not see the early 1900s and the formation of black communities and black organizations to resist segregation as something of a 20th century phenomenon. Again, it goes back to the early 1800s when you see the break-off of African-American denominations as a result of oppression. But in the early 1900s, it picks up steam and it carries on into the civil rights era. But it's already there in the early 1900s. In 1909, for example, you have formed the NAACP. You have towering black intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois, writing works like his 1903 The Soul of Black Folks, and his call for a black conscious understanding of the experience here in America. Now, of course, we want to be careful here. Not everyone that is involved within the black community with the ending of segregation and the Jim Crow laws is doing so from a Christian or religious expression or experience personally. There are certainly those who want it to just simply end, who are fearful of Christianity as the white oppressive religion. However, we can't allow the reality of some who are not Christian to overshadow the fact that just as in the early 1800s, in the early 1900s, it is black pastors and church leaders and Christians who lead the charge for the ending of segregation. And there are a number of features we need to highlight here. The important thing is there is black flight throughout the majority of the 20th century. From 1910 to 1970, somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 7 million African Americans left the Deep South and moved to the North. They moved to urban areas, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Detroit, and they did so in staggeringly high numbers. In fact, from a social historical standpoint, this is the largest single ethnic migration that was not precipitated by famine, disease, or war. This is simply blacks fleeing the oppression of the Jim Crow laws, as well as the racism of the Deep South. 6 to 7 million African Americans moved to the North. Now again, let's not kid ourselves here. This is not a free and egalitarian North. In fact, one of the things that happens, for example, in the city of Detroit, is whenever blacks are being moved into housing projects or into neighborhoods that were designed to accommodate this migration, there are staggering and violent riots in the heart of Detroit to try to stop this migration. And this is just one example, but you see African Americans being pulled off of buses and public transportation. You see armed guards having to make sure that the moving vans were not attacked and destroyed. And this is certainly one blow-up of this, and not everyone did this. But the reality is as blacks move north, they very often settle in urban core areas or in specific neighborhoods. So the black community in Harlem, for example, really skyrockets during the 20th century, as well as Detroit and Baltimore and numerous other cities. So in other words, the story of the civil rights movement, though it has begun in the Deep South, is not simply a problem in the Deep South. Though the fights are in the 50s, it has not begun in the 50s. The problems are there carrying on after the Civil War. Now, the feature we want to highlight here is the role of the church, the black church, as the early 1900s wear on and as we get into the civil rights era, which gets going in full earnest in the 1950s. One of the new realities that we see as a result of black Christian expression is you have things like storefront churches begin to emerge in some of these new urban core areas. Black churches, of course, would either be barred from purchasing property, or no white builders would build for them, or at times they were just simply too poor to build their own churches. And you see a real nimble adaptation of the church life of the black church as they develop this, again, storefront church model, which we still see today, not just in the black church, but in all types of different churches in our own time. But what is happening here? Well, black Christianity is not subsiding. It is not falling away. However, the pressure, the ongoing horror of the Jim Crow laws and of the segregation era, as well as the rampant racism and oppression and violence that we see in just about any quarter of America in the early 1900s, eventually presses home the need for black Christians and black citizens to stand up, to speak out against segregation, and to call for equality. And a number of these stories we're pretty familiar with, of course. The quiet protest of Rosa Parks to not move to the back of a bus because she was tired and therefore being arrested, and the ensuing controversy that really helped give rise to the ministry and the voice of men like Martin Luther King Jr., as well as others, happens in the mid-1950s, 1955, 1956. And there are so many fights and struggles and marches that we simply can't list all of the important ones, much less the next tier down of the widespread but important and less well-known stories of the civil rights movement. There's the fight in Tallahassee. There is Martin Luther King Jr. being arrested. There is the I Have a Dream speech during the March on Washington. Less well-known is the civil rights struggle in St. Augustine, Florida, which Martin Luther King also played a part in. He was also arrested, and he wrote, similarly to his ministry in Birmingham, a letter from the St. Augustine prison. And the violence in this city of St. Augustine to resist the protest for civil rights took an ugly turn, one that actually made national headlines and international headline news, in which, carrying on from the idea of a sit-in and a quiet protest, blacks and whites jumped into a hotel pool to do what they called a swim-in, because this was a pool that was segregated and was only for whites. And the owner of the hotel runs out with muric acid, at least that's what he claimed that he had, and he poured it into the pool, attempting to scald and burn those who were trying to jump into the pool and swim together. And there were pictures taken of him doing this to arrest these whites and blacks who were daring to swim together. And this is in St. Augustine again. the story just carries on. The entirety of the 1950s is shaped and governed by this reality. But here's the point we're making. The civil rights movement and the ministry of men like Martin Luther King Jr. did not spring out of a vacuum, and it was not the first time African Americans had voiced their concern to white Christians that they were not doing enough to deal with the rampant racism and the segregation of their day. Rather, this was the culmination of over a century of Christians and black church pastors resisting, to greater or lesser extents, the implications of the American experience for blacks. Now, the question is, what happens to that witness? What happens to that story? Well, simply put, the 1960s happened, and thereby the 1970s. The 1960s were really a splitting of some of the voices within the civil rights movement, within the black church movement. In 1966, for example, you have the first formation of the Black Power movement, which would eventually, of course, become the Black Panthers and a number of other organizations that were designed not so much to suffer for the sake of the gospel and for the sake of equality, but rather to actualize some of the anger and some of the frustration and some of the pride of being an African American. Of course, Black Power comes immediately after the civil rights movement. Now that there is equality, and at least on paper, the ending of the Jim Crow segregation laws, you see immediately arise a split. You also have in 1963 the bombing of a church in Birmingham, the killing of all kinds of different people, and in other places, all kinds of different struggles. Now, there was some of this certainly in the 1950s. Some of the riots, the race riots that happened from the 1950s through the 1960s and on into the 1970s are simply hard to look at, and most students always say it's very difficult at times to realize that this was just a generation or two ago. Cities and streets that look like war zones, people being beaten, clubbed, shot with water from fire hoses. The brutality of it, it looks again like a war zone. Well, what happens in the 1950s and the 1960s is, again, you have a splitting, and this culminates in 1968 with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Carrying on after the 1960s, you have a more or less kaleidoscope of different voices and different instincts within the black community that go different directions. Obviously, the story of those who leave any semblance of the Christian faith is pretty well known. The voice of Malcolm X, for example, becomes very influential. The Black Muslim Brotherhood, the movement of an alternative faith in rejection to the white faith that was still seen as so oppressive, becomes a new reality for African Americans. Still, though, those within the church, those who held on to their Christian faith, carried on this legacy of standing up against segregation, and after the end of segregation, standing up to overt or softer forms of racism that are not so overt. They carry on the legacy that was there from the early 1800s through the Civil War and all the way through the Civil Rights Movement. And increasingly, as we've seen really in the last few years, just to say the least, the ongoing evolution of the conversation, particularly amongst Christians and amongst evangelicals, as to how to deal with the ongoing legacy, now not of segregation, but of the residual effects of segregation and racism, is one that at times people close their ears to. But as we've seen in this lecture, the story of white evangelicals realizing the implications of their faith and embracing black Christians as equals and brothers and sisters is part of that legacy. However, it has always been driven and carried by the courage of, in particular, black pastors, black church leaders, and those within the Christian community to stand up and remind whites that their commitment to the gospel ought to be lived out in the context of their relationships with their black brothers and sisters.